Hello, everyone. I have a special guest today, Tanner Linsley. He's worked on applications like React Query, React Location, and a few others you might have heard of. So I want to hear about what you've worked on in the past, what projects you've done, and kind of where you've gotten to get to where you're at today.
Oh man, I've been doing open source for like 10 years, I think. So in the beginning, it was just like consumer, leeching off of open source. Eventually I started to want to contribute back, built some tools, really dinky things in Angular back when I was an Angular user. And then when I got into React, started needing some tools that were a little more involved. So the very first one that I actually wanted to do was tables. I had used table utilities in other languages and frameworks, but there was really only one great one for React, and that was AG-Grid. We had some different constraints, couldn't use AG-Grid at the time. I have a talk about that actually that I just did at React Amsterdam.
So AG-Grid is Angular Grid?
No, it's actually agnostic. So, AG-Grid stands for agnostic grid. So they now have adapters for all of the major frameworks, and they are like a batteries included data grid. So very powerful. And, you bring it in and you can do everything with it you could imagine, right? Which is extremely valuable if you need all of that stuff and you don't have time to build any of it. It's just hard to build too. But we needed something that was more lightweight, right? Like kilobytes size, and didn't need all the bells and whistles, just kind of the basic sorting, filtering, grouping type stuff. And so that's when I decided to build React Table. So I built React Table and did pretty well. After React Table, I got into building a tool called React Static, it could have been a great competitor to Next.js and Gatsby. And honestly, if it kept going, it probably would have still been around, but I didn't want to get into that game. It was, the JavaScript framework wars are just crazy. I'd be competing with Next and Gatsby and Remix right now and, Next. And I just don't want to do any of that. It takes a lot of people and money to do that. It was just me. So I let React Static go. I released it back into the water and kept going. And after that, a lot of these libraries I built because I have a startup that I've been working on for a long time called nozzle.io. Nozzle is a rank tracker, marketing, SEO, tooling. If you're not in that space, probably will sound pretty weird, but we reverse crawl Google search rankings and provide that data back to marketers. So I needed querying and tables and charts and basically everything that's in the portfolio for TanStack right now, right? So I built React Table because we needed tables, and I built React Query because I needed a better way to do queries within all the widgets we have on the screen. And
so what is then TanStack? I know React Table, and then there's something else.
TanStack is actually pretty new. Before it was just under my personal GitHub, but I decided to rebrand everything. Right now, TanStack is these 6 libraries, right? So there's Query, Table, TanStack Virtual, which is for virtualization, UI DOM virtualization. There's React Location, React Charts, and React Ranger. These haven't been moved over to be framework agnostic yet, so they still have kind of the React name in them, right? TanStack, as a whole, is just where all this stuff lives, right? And I've done courses before. The official React course is awesome. I have all of these open source sponsors, and we have our own Discord. And we're really good friends with the people at Bytes. So we signed some people up there. TanStack, it's just kind of my little incubator for all the open source stuff that I work on. Nothing crazy.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about it just from seeing what's on Twitter, and specifically React Query. I think that's where, from my perspective, that's where you got the most popularity and all of a sudden everything started taking off.
Yeah, I built React Query because I was using Redux at the time. Still a great tool, but it was the best thing out there for managing data cache from the server. And I didn't want to move to GraphQL. I think Apollo was really cool, but I didn't use GraphQL. I didn't want to move to it, but I wanted the great things that Apollo had in a client. So it's I'm going to build this client, and it's going to be agnostic to the data layer. So you just have to return a promise, and that's all you need to return. And I built it originally inside of Redux. And then at the end of the day, I swapped out Redux for a custom store behind the hood. That's how React Query was born. So it just kind of had this Apollo-y kind of API, borrowed some things from Apollo, borrowed some things from a tool called Dracula, QL, Dracula, I guess. It's hard to say it without spelling it, but it has Q in it. Some ideas from there, and then just kind of rolled in some things of my own opinions. And that's how React Query was born. So I built it internally in Nozzle, and we used it for a while in Nozzle without releasing it. And finally I was this is a great experience. I'm going to release it. So turned it into an open source library, and everybody loved it. Ended up doing some talks on it, built a website for it. I don't know. It honestly was just really great timing because it just kind of blew up, right?
Yeah, for
Hooks
sure.
just come out, and it was a really great tool, like built solely on hooks. So good projects. And yeah, it's been successful. It's still successful. So
Yeah, I think it's interesting too how you were saying you were using Redux. Redux is a more generic store. You can put whatever you want in it, but you have to manage it yourself and figure out how you're going to do it.
right.
And the benefit of React Query is that you targeted a specific piece of the state infrastructure, and that was just data calls. So it's async data fetching. And you put that in there, and then you could target the hooks and everything else specifically tiered for that use case. And that even spun off a Redux plugin called RTK, or Redux Toolkit Query, which is a similar competitor now in the space.
Yeah, and it's amazing what you can design as an API when you just kind of assume that either everything is either synchronous or everything's either asynchronous. And that was one of the things that React Query helped me do. It's like, here's the tool I use to deal with asynchronous stuff, and took over a lot of the things that I built. And it's a really great utility, very flexible.
So I'd like to see if we can get into the source code of it and check out what it looks like and how you develop some of those pieces.
TanStack Query, GitHub. We're going to be looking at the V4. So V4 just came out like a few days ago.
Oh.
But that's the source code we will be looking at.
What changed specifically in V4?
So we got some way better proper offline support. So did some things with network mode so that you can use React Query like in an offline way. That was really helpful for people doing anything like in React Native or just offline in general. We had some persister style plugins. So these were experimental features for like, how can you persist the data cache into various places? And those evolved into sync storage and async storage persisters. So you can like sync stuff to local storage or like to, IndexedDB or wherever you want. We added support for React 18, defaulted React or tracked queries, which just is render optimizations, general API maintenance. Those are kind of the main features around it. Nothing like crazy big, but that's good. Nothing that's like, oh, breaking changes everywhere and refactors. So that's what came new with V4.
Well, I also noticed a note there that it says now you can use React Query in Vue and Svelte and Solid.
Oh yeah. So we rebranded from React Query to TanStack Query, and now it opens up the ability to have adapters for all the other frameworks and the possibility of using it even without a framework if you happen to be that person. So
that sounds like it was a lot of work.
We actually kind of designed it that way very early on. So it wasn't too much work for TanStack Query to do that. Right now we are still working on the adapters for Vue and Solid and Svelte. So Vue and Svelte are coming together right now. Solid probably will be next after that. So
this is all really interesting. To me, this is something that I've tried to solve as well, where you're trying to code a utility for a specific framework, but also make it agnostic to the framework. And in a lot of cases, what you have to do is use a lot of vanilla JS behind the scenes and then add hooks for the hooks to get access to it.
Yeah, the interesting thing is I'd like to think that like TanStack specializes in headless stuff. It turns out when you design headless utilities, like they naturally afford themselves to being agnostic anyway. Like if you look at TanStack Query, one of the packages here, like if we look at the query core, which houses most of like the behavior for all of React Query, like let's go into, here's the query observer. So this is part of the observer pattern we use to like have instances of queries, listen to the original queries. And it's all class-based, so bear with us there.
Do you regret the class-based part of it? Or?
No, not at all. Classes are great for when you're building like primitives and stuff. So it's just a lot of subscription stuff. Things are based around networks. So should fetch on reconnect, should fetch window focus. So like here's like setting options and updating the options for specific query, like observable instances. There's things tracking, if it's mounted, and here's where the actual fetch gets executed, if it's mounted and we should fetch optionally or whatever. So there's a lot of kind of this minutia detail comes out of React Query, but all this inside of here, you'll notice that for this entire file, if we come up to the top here, like there's nothing coming in from React. We basically just removed everything that isn't TypeScript out of these files, right? So this is where a bulk of the work is happening. If we were to come back to packages and go to React Query, we have our source file here, and we have kind of the mirrored API file structure, right? So here's the actual useQuery hook that people know and love. Here's the useQuery. We have a couple of overloads for it. So we'll go down to the actual implementation.
Oh my goodness. Just a couple.
Yeah, just a couple. So hopefully all these are going to go away very soon, but in the next major version, we're going to just have one overload. So the way it works here is like for all these different overloads, we have to like parse the query arguments and figure out what the heck which one we're using, right? We have this base query. So we come out, go into use base query, and all right. So use base query, you can see this is where we're importing like, okay, here's the use sync external source shim, and then here's the core, the TanStack query core. So we have query key type, the notify manager, and the query observer. Right. And that's really all that's coming in this base query. So obviously we're pulling in some of the other core things, but through these utilities. So here's the use base query, grab our options, grab our query client from context, figure out if we're restoring error boundary stuff. And then we have to do a bunch of optimistic stuff even during render so that we make sure that we support suspense.
Does optimistic mean that you're basically duplicating an extra state that's already available so that you have access to it?
Basically, we're doing things during render, but optimistic. So they're not like persisted or like mutate anything important during the render cycle, because that's an important thing. So these are optimistic computations that are happening, in case we need to use them early, like in the case of suspense. Because if you want to do something with suspense, you can't do it in an effect. Like you have to throw in the render function. So the little edge cases, like here's the suspense here. So we say always set the stale time when using suspense to prevent fetching again when directly mounting it. Just like so many very nitpicky little things. This is all the stuff that you would end up writing if you tried to do it on your own. So right here's finally where we get to the observer. So we're using React State to track this new observer. So we create a new observer. This is core React query right here. We're creating a new core query observer, passing in the client and the options. And then we get that observer and then we're able to do stuff with that observer. So,
okay. So this is interesting. The reason this is agnostic to any framework like React is because we're using observables behind the scenes. And so then you can control how the updates work.
And it's not even really observables. Like we implemented our own observer patterns that catered to our like data structures and life cycles.
Yeah, I can see it there. We have like get optimistic result and we have get current result, which are two different things that don't normally exist. You could have like get value, which is the last known value that was in there, but then get optimistic result is something very custom to what you have. So your observer pattern is an observer in the sense that it has a subscribe and I'm assuming an unsubscribe method. But then there are other ways of getting access to the data in there or storing data into the observer that wouldn't normally be there.
Exactly. Yeah, there's the optimistic stuff, which is great for, suspensey type things. Obviously, we're doing subscribing and we're using useSync external store because we're tearing a little bit sometimes. Like everything has to be safe and mutable with concurrent mode in React. So this useSync external store is what helps us get around that. So we can subscribe to individual observers and they can like refire like in the middle of a concurrent rendering phase, and like useSync external store is going to take care of that gracefully for us. So we have to have our own subscription methods. Here's our effects where we do not notify. Okay, let's see. These changes should be reflected. Yeah. So we optimistically set like the settings, the options here, because we need those settings if we're going to do anything with suspense. But then we use an effect here to basically commit them safely after React has done its life cycle. So this is where we're like committing the query options into the observer, right? And then the observer is also going and matching those with other observers that are going to the core query object because share a single query object.
So this result here, this is done at render time. And then the use effect at 97 is done at, I guess, after mount, whenever React is ready to process.
After mount, yep. And anytime the options or the observer like updates, So you'll see here and then the suspense handling right here. So we say, if we're doing suspense, this is the suspense mode where, we're detecting if query is loading or fetching, and then we're throwing the observer's fetch mystic. So this promise is what's kicking suspense into like the suspended mode. And then it's going to resolve, hopefully, when that gets done, it's going to resolve after these defaulted options of success and whatever. And then it's going to re-render and we'll actually have the value.
Okay, so this is something I want to go into a lot because I think this is the most fundamentally different thing I've seen in any React hook in my entire career at this point. So I'm trying to understand what's going on. Does this work in older versions of React, or this is specific to 18, or it's something that has been there, but now it's 100% for real? This is going on.
I mean, if you imported this into something that didn't support suspense, then like even just throwing a promise in render, you could still use it, but if you threw a promise in render, your React app would crash.
Yeah, yeah. So it has to be at least 17, seems like.
To use the suspense features, yes.
Oh, to use the features. Oh, so you can do it even without... Oh, I see. Default options.suspense is a Boolean to say that we want to use the suspense. Okay, okay.
I don't see why not, but there could be some...
Yeah, but this is very interesting. So the fetch optimistic, it has a .catch on it, so we're not throwing an error off the promise, but we're throwing the promise itself. And what I'm wondering is how, like, what the benefit of or what the reason is to throw this promise and how it interacts with the suspense versus just making a call and setting a value.
That's how suspense works. Like when you're in the middle of a render or a hook, if you throw a promise, you're telling React, like that's the API to tell React, hey, you should suspend here and wait because something's not ready yet. So you throw that promise and React is like, oh, we got an error. Oh, hey, look, it's a promise. We're going to wait for that promise to resolve and then try rendering again.
Oh, I didn't know how that worked. Okay, so I knew that with suspense, the way React works is if you throw an error in the component, it just re-renders it again, but doesn't show an error message yet. But I didn't realize that if you throw a promise, there's some special code behind the scenes that waits for the promise to finish and then handles a re-render. So this is what the React team was doing way back in 2017 when they were showing the data fetching API with suspense. Yeah. This is essentially what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's incredible. All right, let's...
So we're just throwing a promise versus error boundaries. We're actually throwing the error.
Okay, so this is a legitimate error.
Yeah. This is the error that we got. This is the error that we got from React. If the query, it was in an error state, this is what it would be.
Normally, when you throw an error in a component, it would cause that to hit the next component did catch up the chain. And so this would bubble up, right?
Yeah, it would. This will hit the earliest error boundary.
So what's the purpose of this particular error here? And why would we want to throw an error in particular?
Well, if you're using suspense, you don't handle your errors in your render functions next to your queries. You handle them in your error boundaries, just like you handle the loading states in your suspense boundaries. So we're saying if we have an error and the error boundary hasn't been reset, and we're not fetching, and we should throw an error. And this comes from like, should we use error boundaries? Are we using suspense? A bunch of other things. Then we throw this error because the user is expecting that error to trigger an error boundary somewhere.
I see.
It's the difference of doing this where you're saying const data error is success or something like that equals useQuery. Right? You do it this way without suspense, you have to handle these error states and success states inside of your render function,
Yeah, that's how I thought React Query, that's how I thought React Query worked.
It is how React Query works. But if you pass, suspense true, now you're not going to get an error right here because it's going to throw it. So you'll handle that error in the outer boundary of wherever you're using this hook. You're not going to get is loading because you're never going to see is loading because that's going to be shown in the suspense boundary. So really all you get is this. And if you're using suspense, then you can basically just, assume that data is going to be there,
Yeah, and it's whatever your API returns. So as long as you have a good contract, then that will always be what you expect.
Yeah. So just a lot of like balancing, like are we using suspense or not? Here's what we do when we are, and here's what we do when we're not. So
I see now. So this if statement is within the if statement that we were previously looking at with the suspense part.
Yeah. So we're in base query, and then no, it's not within the other one. It does have will prove to be true if we're in suspense. So
okay. So this is what triggers the suspense. Yeah, I was looking for the default values.suspense again, but I didn't see it on there.
The use error boundary will get defaulted to true if we're using suspense.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Wow. There's a lot specifically that needs React to execute here. And in the current version, or at least version 3, was this also separated at that time?
Yeah, it was. Not a lot here has changed from version 3 to now. But yeah, you could imagine like all of these things might be implemented a little differently in something like Vue or Svelte or Solid.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the way that suspense, even though they're going to be implemented very differently in all these other frameworks, the query core is solid, and you're going to be able to implement query in any other framework, or I guess TanStack Query in any other framework. It's going to take some work though, like to wire up the lifecycle. That's really all we're doing here is we're just wiring up the lifecycle to the core. If we come out to something like use is fetching, it's a little simpler to see kind of how we're wiring it up, right? But use is fetching is we're just getting, some of the arguments here. getting the query client from context. Using context and Vue and Svelte and other places would be totally different. We would still need to get that query client somehow and get the query cache out of it. And then finally, we need right here, we're wiring uses fetching up with the external store so that whenever the query client up on store change, we are re-rendering this function and returning, is fetching. So basically we're only re-rendering this function when things change here and when this value changes here. That's going to be different in something like Vue and Svelte because, you're using computed values or, like their weird $ observable stuff. So theoretically, it wouldn't be difficult to implement this uses fetching hook in useQuery, which is exactly what they're doing right now. So
do you have an example of what that would look like?
Actually, we could jump over to useQuery. Okay, let's talk about React Table. First, this is the Vue version of use is fetching. You can see it's like exactly the same hook, getting the arguments out of it. And then they are getting the query client. And I guess Vue lets you use hooks to get the query client as well. So that's cool. And then they're using a ref right here, instead of state. Okay, is fetching, it's a ref. Then they're subscribing to the store. And they're saying every time it changes, we're going to update is fetching value to, is fetching this thing. And then they have a watch effect that's like, hey, anytime that the arguments change, we got to change the value. So, it's very similar in spirit. Really all it is when you do these implementations of headless things into frameworks, a lot of the times all you're dealing with is just building the bridge from the headless agnostic stuff. And you're just hooking into the state and the reactivity APIs of said framework. Context, state, and reactivity. That's really what it comes down to. It's like, how do you get context? How do you store your state and update it? And how does your reactivity work? And if you can, integrate your headless tool into those three things, then you can integrate with the framework. So,
okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm looking at it. I'm seeing, use query client was the context grabber for the client that was being used, and then here's your query client. So this is the query client itself is your code. That's not changed. That's the observer.
Yeah, that's just coming from use query client, just follow it. So
I'm a little curious just to see as a Rosetta Stone what I'm looking at. It looks very similar, but also lacking all the extra React features.
So here's use query client. Or sorry, let's go back to the use query that, we saw the big old huge use query thing. It doesn't implement as much, so they do the same thing, use base query. So let's go into use base query. So you'll see a lot of the same stuff in here. Grabbing the query client, they got the observer, initial state, unsubscribe. They're watching the options, same as we were. They're unsubscribing when the hook is getting trashed. Suspense. So if suspense, I don't know what this is. This might be a Vue specific thing.
But it's the same kind of thing that fetch optimistic. It's returning the promise from that function.
Right. So I think they might be, I don't know how the Vue APIs work. Maybe this is just a helper or something like that. It's not entirely the same because, Vue query, this was just a fork that Damien made of React Query at the time. And I was like, yeah, dude, go for it. We're trying to kind of calling these projects home now that we've become agnostic. So there's Vue query and there's also Svelte query. And Svelte query is it even looks like the React website, like the React Query website used to. But we're calling these projects home, to try and get them all lined up with the same API and everything. So
yeah, that would be really nice.
Here's what Svelte query looks like. Here's the components. Yeah, so here's your get post async function, and then use query client, and then use query. Basically, just the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just done in Svelte. And then here are your posts, you've got all your Svelte syntax here. So it'll be really similar.
There's one thing I want to talk about in particular before we get into that is how do you get past people saying you're over engineering? Because it feels like you made this headless from the start. And I've built a lot of headless tools before that were agnostic to the framework I was using. For instance, I built a way to use Redux without React Redux and then created hooks based off of my headless implementation using that because I wanted to be able to switch out Redux with something else if we ever needed to in the future. I'm wondering how you get across when you're building tools like this. How do you say, okay, this is over engineering, this is not over engineering? When does it make sense to build the headless part of it?
It's when it became necessary. React Query started as a single file. There wasn't much else to it, and it's okay to structure your code in a way that makes it easy to delete and move around. Like that's not over engineering. That's just like, making your code bite size and logical and like breaking things down to their primitive parts. Like I didn't add headless from the beginning, and I definitely didn't add any of the features that V3 and V4 had from the beginning. So I think it's just, you need to write your code in a way that will hopefully allow you to refactor easily and change things easily. So using tools like TypeScript, making small functions and, utilities and keeping things really lightweight. You don't need to engineer anything for your use case of like, going beyond the scope of what you need it for until that use case provides itself. So I didn't need React Query to even work as an open source library for a long time. It just lived inside of Nozzle and it used utilities from Nozzle. It wasn't until I wanted to open source it that I went in and I pulled those utilities in and, structured a little bit bigger. And then we needed it to work better with, hooks. So built in the hook thing and then, going agnostic. And so it just kind of gradually works its way up. As long as you can refactor easily, like there's nothing stopping you from just doing it incrementally.
Yeah, I often try to, when I'm building APIs like that, where I know there's some business need that's going to change in the next 6 months, I try to build in the capabilities that it might need or stubs for the capabilities that it might need so that you can just add it when you need to. Like I'm wanting to get your opinion on, would you feel comfortable doing that ahead of time when you were building React Query? Was it, oh, okay, I might open source this, so I'm going to kind of leave certain things up, or was that not part of the initial idea?
Oh, you can definitely think that way. It's smart to just say, instead of trying to tackle all of the use cases, we're going to build this thing to do one thing that's, very simple and composable, right? When you build your tools contextually to rely on a bunch of different environment variables that you have, kind of lock yourself into a specific setup. And I have API stuff that I've designed in a lot of my tools where I'm just like, oh, this could accept a ton of different parameters and do a bunch of things, but I'm actually just going to have it do this one thing so that in the future, if I want to branch out, to do something else, then it's going to be an easy integration. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm like deliberately preparing for that as much as I'm just trying to naturally keep things simple and composable.
Oh, interesting. That design style just happens naturally because keeping things simple usually means making smaller pieces and then also abstracting where necessary.
Yeah, and just trying to do do more with less. And a lot of times I haven't done it that way. Like React Table did a bunch of stuff for you that it probably shouldn't have done. And then so in React Table version 7, I went headless and I had to rip out all the UI work that I was doing for people. And I was like, hey, you have to build your own table markup now. And everybody's really angry about that. They're like, yeah, but look, it's a headless hook. You drop in this template and you're back to where you were, But then V7 had plugins. And in V8, like I made everything better, but I ripped plugins out. I'm like, hey, look, like you can't use plugins anymore because that was a bad idea. And so I had to rip plugins out. Everybody's like, what am I going to do? How am I going to get from my plugins to, to V8? I'm like, okay, like you have more control now, just not the type of control that you had before with plugins. So it's not foolproof. I definitely have designed bad APIs before.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was talking about React Table and different people were looking at data systems because there's, they're building a component library and they're saying, hey, we want to use something. And I always recommend React Table because I've used it before. And they're always saying, oh, we got to do everything from scratch. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's wonderful. When did that happen? That sounds amazing. Yeah. So I might be in a different boat too, that I prefer the headless system more because it allows you to design and develop the way that you need and it doesn't get in your way of your application.